Take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Jason. And can you see my slides in full view?
I can.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share some of the research we've been conducting over the last a little over a year on actually the holdings in the Opioid Industry Document Archive. And a lot of what Dr. Welu mentioned in the opening talk was resonates with our research team's experience. And I'll share a little bit about that. Before I get going, I am a faculty member in the International Health Department at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I do a lot of research on health taxes, particularly in the food and beverage industry. This has led me to this work in part because corporate political strategy actually is fairly consistent and very creative across industries. I'll say that to begin, that the work I'm going to be talking about involved a team of people that were dedicated to this. Ross McKenzie in Australia, Ben Hawkins, both of these individuals have worked quite extensively with the Tobacco Archive in the past. Ben Hawkins is at Cambridge University. Daniel Eisencraft Klein, who I think we are lucky to have with us actually on the webinar and possibly in the workshop later today. He's a PhD student at the University of Toronto. And then we had two master's students in our international health program, Sanaya Shenoy and Mustafa Ahmed. So together we creatively kind of, when you approach these archives, a lot is similar to the Tobacco Archive, but given the context in which these documents are being done, primarily the technological advances over the last 20 years, there are some differences. And we tried to point that out, when we were first exploring the archive to kind of define the contours of the stories that we thought were important for telling and were underrepresented in the public consciousness. And in the research domain, we put together a primer. There are great resources on the archive, which we do point to in this document as well. This is more for researchers, but there are great resources as well on the Opioid Industry Document Archive about how to begin and how to access different materials, suggested search terms, et cetera, some of which Kate just mentioned. If you're still looking for more and how this differs from the Tobacco Archive, feel free to check out this paper. So I want to talk about kind of three strands of our research and the way we went about identifying the strands of this research and then pursuing it once we knew what the heck it was we wanted to focus on. So this is a good example of, because it can be intimidating looking at all the holdings and they're constantly growing and things are returned to you, even if you order them by date, sometimes they're not by date. So you're trying to make sense of this just massive amount of data. And oftentimes, researchers follow hunches, and those hunches lead to dead ends, but sometimes they lead to productive means, to productive avenues for further research, and there's further branching down the road. We came across, this was an email that we saw early on in the archive, and some of you may have come across it who are familiar with the archive's holdings, written from an academic. Again, to Dr. Welu's, academics are a key part of this because they can be knowledge brokers. And in this case, a group at the University of Wisconsin who is involved in cancer care treatment, expanding access to cancer medications, end-of-life care for cancer and easing pain, had reached out to a lawyer that they work quite closely with, incidentally, it goes by the email address of Bill No Pain. And again, to Dr. Welu's point, in this exchange, I didn't know what they were talking about when we first did this research. It didn't make a lot of sense, but it starts off with, I'm impressed that you could detect our fingerprints. I'll wear gloves next time. Anytime you see a line like that, you know that there's something there, that the person is admitting doing something that's, in maybe a tongue-in-cheek way, that maybe is not fully ethical or is ethically questionable. In this case, they were talking about the lawyer had reached out to them asking if they had a hand in some legal changes in one state. And again, we once you get into the holdings, you realize that actually part of the corporate strategy was really focused on state level legislation and policymaking because they had the ability to do that and they knew it worked. And these academics had worked to change this Intractable Pain Treatment Act statute to a general pain statute, which also removed the prescribing restrictions for quote unquote addicts. And again, in the context of 2005, they weren't convinced that that painkillers were actually addictive at this time. They were pretty convinced, the research group, we were come to learn that they were not. In fact, they published editorials in academic journals saying that, addiction was a myth. So after we looked at this, we looked at these Intractable Pain Treatment Act, and we also looked at the operation of this group for the federal, state medical boards. The director had worked through there, and they started removing things. They had worked with states to remove things like the prescription monitoring plans, which would flag providers who were, you would be able to track prescriptions for things like opioids. So we knew that this was something to follow, and then we saw the group surface again, particularly the leader, in a very carefully scripted statement in a hearing in front of the U.S. Congress surrounding the Pain Relief Promotion Act. And again, this is something that you might see mentioned in a lot of news stories, but President Clinton actually signed into law in the year 2000 a decade of pain control and treatment. And this was a symbolic act that would invest more resources and legitimize pharmaceutical corporations' pursuit of addressing kind of the crisis of untreated pain that they argued was persistent in the United States. So they're going to vote a decade. And now we since know in hindsight that decade is the decade when the opioid crisis really started escalating, and even right before it peaked. So again, we knew that this group and these individuals were very involved, but we didn't know a lot about them. But we did come across a research proposal that was submitted to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which started an initial project looking at scoring, this is in the archives holdings, that scored states according to their pain policies. And an A is actually limited pain policies. So that's there's greater access to pain control, painkillers, whereas a poorly performing state has more legal and regulatory hurdles. So in ranking states, there's particular language about, reducing the regulatory barriers to pain access. And you can see this was funded by, major philanthropic organizations and grant-making bodies in the United States. This group, this report is from 2014, and it was, some of their older reports are in the archive, but we used this archive as a way to kind of direct us, and then we would then do searches broader through other materials. One of the ways that their website had been removed, but one of the ways that you can get it's imperfect is using something like the Wayback Machine. So we're able to, this crawls the internet and looks at websites and archives them in a fairly regular way, even though it's also got lots of holes and bugs and stuff. But this was a useful way to look at how the group's activities. Since then, we have, they started the IPPF in your upper right is a pain policy fellowship that they held with international participants who would fly in and learn about how to reduce regulatory barriers to painkillers in their countries. There were online courses, and opioid consumption was a good thing for this group. So we have since then launched a whole program. I mean, we have several different research endeavors tied to the activities of these very influential knowledge brokers. And a lot of what they did was published, is in the peer-reviewed journal, are in peer-reviewed journals, and we've coded that data, and we're now looking at it and hopefully in a position to share some of the findings soon. Another, again, so the importance with the archive is that this helps point you in the right direction. It says there's something there, and maybe the full scale of the group's activities and how they interacted with other kind of industry-friendly academics, consultants, and by the way, they were being paid by Purdue Pharma at the time. Maybe all of this is hard to piece together exactly using the archive, but it serves as kind of a launch point and a frequent reference point as you go through these kind of these iterative cycles of interpretation with different sources of data. The second research theme has been led by Daniel Eisencraft-Klein, and this looks at, again, as Dr. Welu mentioned, industry pushes products. Well, a lot of the pharmaceutical corporations have argued that they're filling demand and for needed painkillers for people that need them, and that the deviants, the people who are abusing these, are a small number of individuals. Well, we looked at, we disagree, and the archive shows that large corporations, particularly Mallinckrodt, which had the largest market share of the market for painkillers at the peak of the crisis, actually developed these very proactive sales strategies that had things like sales competitions. And we developed this. This is a sheet from their Operation Change Agent, where they were actually instructing healthcare providers for how to switch from OxyContin under regulatory scrutiny to their products, which were largely generic brands of hydrocodone. We did a structured search for this after we knew kind of broadly that we wanted to look at these sales strategies. What were the incentives? What were some of the attractive points, and what were the nuts and bolts for how they worked? There's in the archive, there's things like this. This is the brand acceleration plan. A lot of the strategic planning actually was documented and is available in the archive. Daniel very cleverly developed search strategy looking at sales competitions. And we have a paper now that's under review that's looking at all of the different ways that sales teams were incentivized to increase their margins. If you read the newsletter, the Force, there is lots of language about, the highly emotive aspect of selling your product. This is an example. Put some emotion in your sales, become a maniac on a mission. This is not what a sales team that's filling demand would do. This is actually generating demand. And these competitions that are well documented actually in the archive, I think we found something like 440 plus hits when we narrowed our search strategy, provide a window into how these corporations actually generated demand over time, which resulted in a public health crisis. And then finally, one of our more recent streams, we had a master's student that looked at how the corporations that are part of the opioid crisis respond to allegations of wrongdoing. And the theory is that actually in some industries, when companies are challenged with these threats to their business model that severely inhibit kind of public perceptions of their business dealings, they can create, arguments or defenses and public apologies that are actually enhancing their market position, because they may seem like apologies, but they're actually corporate defenses masquerading as apologies. We came up with this because we first noticed the crisis playbook put together by HDMA in the Opioid Industry Document Archive. It shows what to do when, who to contact, at which regulatory agency or which network of actors. And that got us thinking that actually how these corporations are responding is really important. This is actually featured in, I think the hot takes or the hot docs, a series of resources that are put together by the archive team. So we looked at, we wanted to go, however, a little bit deeper. So we looked at a business and management studies kind of framework that deconstructs these types of apologies. And apologies are a very specific type of corporate kind of phenomenon. And we focus on the crisis response and then how ethical they were. I don't have time to go into each of what counterattack, differentiation, transference, apology, and legal responses are, but many of these are fairly intuitive. A lot of the crisis response is denial, where the organizations just say they didn't do anything wrong. Counterattack is where they actually redirect to counter the accuser, assuming the position of victim, exploiting kind of sense of moral justice. Differentiation is where they actually distance themselves from wrongdoing by attempting to redefine it, explain it, etc. And transference is scapegoating, where the company is not to blame, but maybe somebody within the company, few rogue actors are to blame. So if we applied this to actually 3 companies that are somewhat different, and part of our criteria is we wanted to know, we wanted a diversity of crisis communication tactics. We understand how they were responding to these allegations. And then they had to be somewhat influential, and they had to be present in the archive. But again, like our first stream, the universe of our data sources were not necessarily archival material, because in fact, some of these apologies are actually fairly recent, and the litigation predates some of the apologies. That said, Mallinckrodt, the largest opioid manufacturer to settle to date, we looked at Mallinckrodt, we compared it to McKinsey, who also issued a very formal and carefully scripted public apology. McKinsey & Company is not, they're a management company, and they work in a variety, they're a management consulting firm, they work in a variety of different fields. Healthcare is just one of them. And then the Joint Commission on Hospital Accreditation, which sets clinical guidelines and standards. You might think of pain as the 5th vital sign and pain scales. A lot of the changes that this group in Wisconsin and a lot of other industry actors issued that were sponsored by philanthropic organizations, actually, the changes to the clinical treatment guidelines through the Joint Commission allowed or created incentives for providers to change their behavior. Remember, consumers can't select these products. Providers served as gatekeepers. So when we compared them, we found with Mallinckrodt outright denial. There was some corrective action, although we would argue that this was largely forced by a court of law. And then there was quite a bit of differentiation seeking to kind of explain away any allegations of wrongdoing. McKinsey & Company, keep in mind that they're actually part of their remit when they consult with other companies and with the federal government and governments around the world is to actually draft apologies when they're faced with allegations of wrongdoing. So they also denied wrongdoing, and also, unlike Mallinckrodt, there's a transference where some of their statements of guilt actually allude to, a few bad actors, but not the company itself is facing as doing anything wrong. And they do talk about corrective action, even if it's not terribly sincere. And then finally, the Joint Commission, which actually has only been sued once in West Virginia. They are a non-governmental organization. However, I'd argue in the absence of a real robust regulatory system for healthcare in the United States, they have an outsized kind of role in healthcare in the regulation of health service delivery. And they've flat out counterattacked and have engaged in a fair amount of differentiation explaining away. And in fact, they went so as far as one of the leaders developing a 5 common myths about actually the Joint Commission's role in the opioid crisis. We think, again, so this is the type of research that you can do with the archive. We think it's important to pursue. The archive is an exciting place. There's plenty of material for everyone. It's constantly evolving. It is incomplete because of that. And for us, it's been an important springboard and a frequent reference point as we go and explore all these phenomena through different avenues. So I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has.
All right. Thanks, Adam. That was wonderful. And just because we're, again, pressed for time, I want to jump right into a different research perspective here from GB out of Babson College, excuse me. So if you want to just take it away, introduce yourself, and yeah, tell us a little bit more about how you're using the collection and some of the research you're doing as well.